This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back, and this is the HTML All Things Podcast. This episode, a little bit of a working title. We might change this up, but the current working title is Monorepos Unpacked, the good, the bad, and the turbocharged. Bringing in the old, Clint Eastwood, a little bit of a reference there. But anyway, I just recently watched that movie for the first time. Funny enough, I recently watched that. I watched all three. I don't remember them all, but there's a trilogy, yeah. There's the good, bad, the ugly, I think is the second or third of a trilogy. So, anyway, pretty good, I feel like, old westerns. But monorepos, Mike's going to kind of dive into this. I actually have no idea what a monorepo is. I've only heard about it in passing, so I'm sure I'll be asking a bunch of newbie questions, which hopefully are valuable for the user, or for the listener, excuse me. So, if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. Mike, please take it away, sir.
Yes, sir. So I think this has kind of become a pretty hot topic lately because of the monorepo landscape of new tools and services that kind of make it easier for you to use monorepos. I think they've been around for a long time. I want to be clear about that. Monorepos have been around forever. Since we got into development, monorepos were a big thing. But I think for web development specifically, they became really, really popular over the last maybe 2 or 3 years because of tools like NX and TurboRepo and PNPM especially that made it a little bit easier to manage what they are. And this is what I want to get into. Like, what is a monorepo? For people that have never touched it, Matt, you mentioned you haven't touched a monorepo before. When you're working on a bigger project, let's say, that has multiple moving pieces to it. So some of those pieces might be a back end. One of those pieces might be a front end. One of those pieces might be several front-end applications like a dashboard, maybe that touches the back end, and a web app that touches the back end, and another application that maybe uses the same authentication or the same database that touches that back end. Whatever, you have multiple moving pieces in a large project. This is a very typical scenario for larger teams and larger organizations. What you'll typically have is a choice. You either make each one of those projects a separate repository, a separate project, essentially, and then integrate them somehow through packages like importing dependencies or some sort of API layer communication between each one, like somehow integrating all of these from a development perspective, right? How are you going to communicate between the two? How do you know what types are in what place? Like what's the database? What's the front end? How does the front end know what the back end has, etc.? From a developer perspective, you would either completely separate them out, and that's called a polyrepo. And a polyrepo, I want to be clear, is like the traditional repository that you would have with like a regular, starting a Svelte project. You have a single project in there. That's a polyrepo, right? But what a monorepo is instead of that, you would have all of your projects under one large repository, right? So Git would be managed on top at the top level of that. And then you would have like a folder for apps. And in that app folder, you would have like a dashboard app. You would have your main app. You would have analytics app, whatever you would have in there. And then you would have a packages folder in the root layer, which would have all of your packages potentially, which could be like a UI library or maybe your configurations for Prettier and ESLint and your code quality stuff, maybe a testing library in there. Like you would have your shared packages that aren't necessarily applications that you would deploy in a packages folder. And then everything is housed again in one folder and code is specifically shared between each other in that sense. So again, monorepo, everything housed in one folder, polyrepo, separate folders, and you're somehow stapling them together if you need to access different pieces of different projects. This is a very common thing that people do.
I'm going to just ask a question right off the top. This sounds more dangerous Is there any danger that's included with this? Like someone's going to come in there and just wipe out something that they didn't mean to because they didn't realize it was relevant to another part of the project or another team's work?
Oh, yeah. So access control challenges is one of the main monorepo challenges. And I have a whole section for monorepo challenges later in the episode, but that's one piece of it where like absolutely it could become more difficult to manage access to different parts of your application and have it so that like random junior comes in and destroys a part of the application that they shouldn't have been touching. Now, having said that, with Git integration, being able to fall back on stuff with good deployment services, that's not really that much of an issue. It's only an issue if you have literal walls that you want to put in place where you don't want a certain team to access certain code for whatever reason. Maybe you're trying to build competing teams that are trying to build the same project and you don't want them to see each other code. Like that's a competitive thing that companies like Apple does and stuff like that, where you kind of set two teams and then whichever team wins doesn't get laid off, whatever. Like that's an extreme case. Don't actually take that into consideration. I think that was something that was done during like Steve Jobs era, not anymore. But regardless, that could be something a company wants to do, in which case, yeah, you can't really manage access to the code, but you can certainly manage making sure that people like junior developers can't deploy stuff anyway. So there's ways around it.
And another thing too is, I mean, this sounds like it's a method of organization from what you said so far. However, are there organizational challenges? So we've already talked about sort of the access challenges and things are being overwritten and things like that. But what about the idea of where the line is and like how do we split this up? Does this happen a lot where someone goes, you know what, like this should actually be its own like kind of top level directory. This should be its own thing, or this needs to be consolidated. Like, I feel like there would be a lot of that in a monorepo.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that actually is more of a positive than a negative because it makes developers think about how to componentize, how to separate out larger aspects of the application and make them more shareable, right? So whereas when you're working in a polyrepo, that's not as relevant, like you're mentioning, like, you know, you just build everything into like whatever. In a monorepo, you very much have that mindset of like, hey, I'm building this. Yes, I'm building this for this app, but it could be used by X app in the future. Maybe I build this out into a separate lib package inside the monorepo and then import it. And I think that's a really good thing, honestly, that monorepos bring. Now, just to move on here, why are developers increasingly adopting monorepos, right? With the rise of full stack development, especially in web development and microservices, right? Monorepos have become more and more relevant. Monorepo DX, like developer experience, has gotten significantly better over the years, like I was saying. PNPM came around, I think. That's the biggest one, where it has a feature called workspaces. A lot of these monorepo packages are built on top of that. And it just makes it really easy to share dependencies across your different projects inside of a monorepo, which was one of the big pain points where you essentially like npm install and then every one of your applications would install its own dependency chart. And then you would be super bloated down the line. That's what PNPM comes in and solves completely, where if, you know, one app has a dependency and another app has the same dependency, there's a central location for those dependencies to be tracked and central locations for them to be installed so that they're not installing multiple of the same thing with a million other dependency charts that go with it. And just to give kind of some personal context here, currently for the past year or so, I've been using TurboRepo at work, which is a monorepo package that I mentioned that's built on top of PNPM workspaces. And it's specifically developed by Vercel to work really well with their hosting system. And this is where like a lot of my personal experience will come into this, is that because we've gone through a lot of challenges, a ton of challenges, getting it set up and making sure that the entire team is kind of aware of all the pitfalls of it and moving to a point where we can be just as productive as we were, if not more productive, way more productive than we were before because of all the advantages that I'm going to talk about in a second. So I've been there with everyone where like the monorepo is a headache. I have spent hours in some days just dealing with monorepo bullshit. And I understand some people's hesitation on it because I had some hesitation initially as well. But after having used it for about a year now and getting through all those headaches initially, I can confidently say that it is the right choice for most organizations. And There are some disadvantages, but I think the advantages well outweigh those disadvantages that come up.
Well, let me hop in then, because I have a question there. So like it sounds like it's an investment in a better future for your repo in that context. However, you're saying if it's great for most businesses likely, or most projects, I suppose, likely. But do you think that everyone would have to have that same year of investment? Because that would be a huge stepping stone. Like that'd be something where it's like, hey guys, we're going to lose, say 20% or something like that of our productivity, of our coding productivity, or coding output, where we're going to take all, let's just say, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point, but we're going to take these 5 repos we have, we're going to throw them all into one repo, and then we're going to have, better, and you're going to get into the, why teams love it. You're going to get more into that in this episode, but because of this, and this. But then you got to tell the project manager or whomever is managing the time and productivity of the company, and you got to go, but we got to have a year investment. Like that's a big investment of time.
So just to be clear, it's not exactly like you're saying where like it's you lose 30% productivity for the year just to get that like 30% boost after. It's more like you lose a little bit of productivity in certain situations, but you gain probably 50% productivity in others. So even during the learning curve, it's a net positive, right? As you learn it, it's a significant net positive though, once you're at the end of that curve. Because of the optimizations it gives you with a lot of tools that it has built in, and a lot of the advantages of a monorepo, some things become so easy to work with that again, that 30%, mitigate that 30% productivity hit is mitigated by that in like the first week almost of using it. So that's where like it just doesn't matter. Like, yeah, there's going to be some struggles, but there would have been more difficult struggles had you have went with the poly route before.
This sounds like it's going to need a lot of, I want to just say like a to-do app or something. It sounds like it's going to need like another system alongside it to keep things organized more than it already is. Like I can imagine just, off the top of my head, right now I sort of take in requests from clients. I kind of work all over the place. One day I'll be working on a form. The next day I'll be working on a whole new site. Next day I'll be just working on a page type thing. And so for me, I'm more or less making myself tickets, but they're just, detailed to-dos. I'm just using Microsoft to do them literally. But this almost sounds like it would need like a proper productivity app alongside it to keep this organized. Like, is there, like, I know we just discussed like the, maybe it's not as bad with the, the year investment and such, but is this just feels like it's adding overhead to me off the top. Is that maybe I should just like let you kind of like rip through the, the advantages and kind of dive in, but just right away, I'm kind of like, whoa, this sounds like it's going to be like, well, we're going to have a lot like Notion and Trello, or maybe, a combination of both or something. We're going to have automations to let people know when to push and when to do this and how the PR structure is going to work and things like that. And it's just going to be like, this is all over the place. We're going to need another app to keep us all in check, just organizationally. Like, is that like, am I wrong at all?
Yeah. So we didn't add any other applications on top to be able to manage this. So we're just using Linear, which is like a Jira similar thing to manage all of our productivity. And it's like, we haven't had to add special to-dos essentially to be able to manage cross-team monorepo stuff. That's not to say that there isn't any overhead. There is some overhead for sure. There's some like scripts that we had to write, like you were saying. There is some overhead, absolutely, because you have many different applications and there's different ways to start each application. Depending on how intertwined they are, you have to start them in different ways. But again, because of how our apps are structured and how dependent they are on each other, the alternative of having them in separate repos would have been more difficult to do this in, because they're already intertwined. This is the most important thing, is like these apps are like, if it's a back end and a front end, those are intertwined regardless. They need to be started together regardless. What a monorepo does is it gives you tools to easily start them together and have that dependency kind of handled it in a more streamlined way, rather than figuring out how to jank them together from 2 separate repos.
Okay.
Right.
So like, I see what you're saying. Like like there's going to be benefits of keeping, things together in a monorepo. And then
Yes.
Because like there would have had to have been organizational systems, maybe even just Linear and Jira or whatever, but there would have to have been some sort of organization even in the, was it polyrepo? I think you call it the multiple repo situation as well. So I guess like that overhead, like certainly there's going to be some different overhead with monorepo, as you already mentioned, but like there is kind of always, I suppose, organizational overhead. So you can't really escape that too much.
That's exactly it. Exactly. So it would just be different overhead for connecting the repos together. And that's where the advantages of the monorepo come in. So just to dive right into those advantages, right? Like, why do teams love monorepos so much? And if you go on, I would say the majority of teams will choose monorepos, even if you like to click it. If you search poly versus mono in Google, I think a lot of those articles in the top 10 are going to be in favor of monorepos. Just from that perspective, I'm seeing that being the case. And then also on X and social media, a lot of people do like monorepos. There is always going to be a dissenting voice. And that's a good thing, I think, because again, it pushes monorepos a little bit and it has these options. Like, I think options are always good. And there's always going to be also certain circumstances where they don't fit, right? Like it's not a silver bullet for everything. If you have like a single application with a developer team of a couple people that has, maybe this doesn't fit for you because of the overhead that it's going to be adding. But when you have a larger application that has intertwined services, I almost guaranteed that a monorepo is going to benefit you rather than hindering you. So with that, first thing that it does, I've already mentioned this a little bit, simplified dependency management. So having multiple repositories, you would have to have, you obviously have multiple package.jsons or package files that manage your dependencies. And each one of those would have to install its own dependencies and have it so that you have essentially completely separate ones across the repos. And you would have to open them all up separately and all that. And you'd have to, do a pnpm install on each one separately. What a monorepo does is that, yes, you still have your separate package.jsons, but from the root of a monorepo, you can actually run pnpm or npm install, and it will install all of the dependencies across every single project all in one go. It won't install duplicates. It'll install one if multiple dependencies are being used across multiple projects, and they'll both reference it. It'll do that all automatically. So it'll save you space. It'll save you time. It'll save you the organization of having to, again, keep all of your dependencies up to date because it's one command versus running, potentially 5 or 6 separate commands, depending on how you're working on it. So that's a big one. It's definitely saved us a bunch of time in that sense, especially with PNPM, because there's something about PNPM. I feel like it deserves its own episode. It really made dependency management so much more bearable. With NPM, for example, again, each repository, each folder has to have its own folder of node modules that install every single time. And it takes forever. Like sometimes it can literally take minutes to install all those. Whereas with PNPM, if a dependency is ever installed across any project, it will put that into like a central location, essentially a cache on your computer. And then instead of going after and looking at the cache online and downloading from there, it'll literally take like a symlink from your cache on your computer and put it into your package node modules folder and have it just work seamlessly and install instantly. Like my PNPM installs take 3 seconds, 2 seconds, where again, an npm install could be minutes. So that's a big one. Code sharing and reusability. So monorepos definitely promote a more modular approach. Matt mentioned it immediately with like, hey, wouldn't people just always be thinking about putting stuff into a package or putting stuff into the lib folder and like extracting stuff out? Absolutely, that's the case. That happens all the time. Where in our group Slack chat, people will be like, hey, I'm building this feature. Maybe I should put it into our UI folder, or maybe I should put it into our lib folder or whatever. And then we'll have a discussion on it real quick and decide if that's worthwhile or not. But that allows for really easy code sharing, really good principles, like dry principles. And it's just a lot simpler. Like, do not repeat yourself. I should be clear. I don't like saying acronyms without explaining what they are. Dry, DRY, is what you call do not repeat, which is like a principle of like, if you have to write something more than twice, it makes sense for you to put it into like a component or put it into a live folder so that you can share it and only write once. Yeah, so that's one big thing. A big pain in the butt if you have polyrepos is if you have a UI library that's shared between the polyrepos, like you have the same buttons and the same form fields and all the same stuff. What you would usually have to do is actually publish that UI library as a separate package, as a separate thing to NPM, and then install that package into all of your other repos and manage that dependency like that. So I think there are ways to set it up where you can actually hot reload in a certain way where like if you update the UI package, it'll hot reload into your other applications that are dependent on it in a polyrepo situation. But I looked into it. It's a pain in the ass to set up. And again, you're managing a literal NPM package inside in NPM, like the service NPM at that point, just to be able to share UI components, which is kind of a pain. Again, other ways to do it, but that's one way that I saw people doing it outside of a monorepo. In a monorepo, it's literally a UI folder inside of your packages, and the import statements are, you just import into your package.json folder as a workspace, and it picks it up. If you do changes to the UI, it'll automatically reflect in your dev server. It's just a really, really smooth experience. This was the main reason we decided to go with a monorepo where I work, right? Like this was like the first step of being like, hey, we have I think we had 2 applications at the time, and they shared some UI components, and we're like, okay, do we go monorepo? Do we not go monorepo? And our decision was, hey, we either do this crazy NPM package thing or we go monorepo. We decided monorepo. Now we've had multiple other things that we've integrated since then that have been a benefit in the monorepo, but that was the deciding factor for us.
Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes. Let me ask a question there then. Like, do you think that going monorepo early in a project is crucial or critical in any way? Is there kind of a time limit on this? Because I'm just kind of wondering, I guess it's almost a double-faceted question of the scalability of this. Are there projects that you think that are going to be too big to like be monorepo? Like, is there a growing part where it's like, okay, let's go monorepo. This is the ideal time. We'll do it. Oh, we actually grew to be, a crazy large application. We now have to separate everything out of the monorepo. Like, is there an ideal time to start? Is there a time that you should be getting out?
I think there is a scaling issue. And again, that's one of the things to watch out for in monorepos, where if you have like 100 services or something like that, you just might have too much code that you're managing inside of one repository, essentially. Because when you load it up in VS Code or any IDE or Vim, you're loading up the monorepo specifically. And so when you're doing a search, you have to either search like a search pattern on the folder that you need to search on, or you're searching the entire monorepo. So it could get pretty crazy if there's too many apps. Now, it's a tough one. Like if you're an agency, this is a good example. If you're a web agency and you're going to be managing 100, 200 clients, you know that from the start, you're a web agency. A lot of times in that case, a monorepo doesn't make sense because of what you're saying, Matt, because you're going to be scaling to the point where there's just too many projects inside of one repository. Yes, the advantages are still the same. Like you're an agency, so you have the same UI library, I would assume, and that really does help. But because it's going to eventually eclipse, I'm saying 100 repos as just like a random number benchmark. It might be less, it might be more than that. But eventually going to eclipse a point where it's just going to become too unwieldy to like even get, clone the repo, because there's just so much you're cloning at that point. You need to think about maybe doing a more longer term approach of, yes, this UI library might have to be its own package, and you might have to deal with the dependency management yourself, and you might have to do all that because of the fact that it's just too much of a pain, or you just import the UI library manually or something like that. Because I don't think an agency is a good use case. Like, especially like, separate clients inside of your monorepo. I don't think that's the greatest use case for a monorepo.
Well, the thing with the clients too, and like I can already imagine this as well, is like the majority, let's say it's WordPress sites, the majority of WordPress sites is not done with code. I mean, depending on how you use WordPress, generally speaking, you might be coding a little bit, but you're using the WordPress admin side of things to, install plugins and among other things. And one of the things I can already imagine is something like, I'm going to search out something in Elementor, one of the very popular page builders on there. And some people, not to mention that multiple people might have Elementor, but some might have Elementor Pro, some might have just Elementor, and some might have a modified Elementor that like someone has gone in and done some changes to. And if you're doing a search for something generic and you change the wrong thing, like you're ripping some random client's thing apart, which is not great. So, but yeah, I can already see something like that in a situation like that, especially with the search, like you mentioned, where you might be searching for something like I mentioned Elementor, but searching for anything else, like another really popular WordPress plugin, WP Forms, something like that. Well, that might be a disaster. Like search WP Forms. I want to make a quick little form change. And how many of these clients, like you have 100 clients, how many of these clients have WP Forms, but then also have a form called Contact Us? Like, already you could see, holy, like I'm going to have to add filters, blah, blah, blah. And now it's slowing me down. Every time I got to search, I'm going to have to filter. There comes a point where it's like, hey, these projects effectively should not be touching each other.
Yep. That's exactly it. There's another situation where you probably wouldn't want a monorepo. And that's if one of your projects is going to be open source and one isn't, you don't want to put them in the same repository because you can't open source one without the other, essentially. There might be some janky way,
right?
Yeah, there might be some janky way to do it, but I wouldn't entangle those because there's risks of the non open source one being somehow leaked into the open source one. You want to keep those pretty separated. So that's another reason. Again, if you have a UI library that's shared between them, you would probably open source that UI library as well and import it as a npm package, like in a traditional sense. So again, not a silver bullet. Not for every single situation, but a lot of situations don't have those caveats. Like usually you're not going to have 100 projects in a monorepo. That's not something that you would be worried about. Usually you're going to have, 5 or 6 or 7, however many you would need to power whatever platform you're working on that needs that code reusability. Like you wouldn't put a random ass application that doesn't need any of the code from that project, from that monorepo into a monorepo just because for organizational purposes. That's not something you do with them. You group them by like some organizations will have like 5 monorepos, whereas like these 5 monorepos are in charge of all of our banking, and these 5 monorepos are in charge of whatever like analytics. I don't know. Like you can have multiple monorepos that are grouped based on the code that they're sharing.
Like maybe like one monorepo for the web apps, one monorepo for the marketing sites if you have multiple, one monorepo for landing pages if those are like for some reason separate from the marketing sites because they're rapid fire for sales or whatever.
Could be, yeah, it could be. You probably package those together again to share the UI, but whatever. Like it doesn't matter. It's just you would have many different situations where you can share code and some situations where you don't need to. So you wouldn't obviously just force it in just for fun. Next thing here is consistency across teams. This is another reason that people love it because it's kind of difficult to enforce patterns, to enforce formatting, to enforce the right tooling. When you have multiple polyrepos, it's not impossible. Like you can have templates and stuff like that. But realistically, all you need to do in a monorepo is set the package to the right one and set your configuration once, like your prettier configuration once to be shared in a shared package. You set your ESLint configuration to be in a shared package. This is something I went through a couple months ago, and it was pretty fun, but also kind of a disaster and really difficult. But regardless, once you set it, you forget it. Like literally, I set it 2 months ago and I've literally forgotten about it because all of our applications now use the exact same formatter, the exact same linter. And now all the code looks the same and no one even cares about it because it's just running in the background. And I love that. That's what you want from your tooling. Whereas with, again, polyrepos, it's a little bit more difficult to keep them all in sync. Like what if you change a formatting in one because it's just even more convenient or something like that, and you forget to change it in all the other ones? It becomes a problem because now all your code is looking a little bit different I can just change it in literally one file. Every app reflects that file. Super convenient. Improved collaboration. Everyone is working obviously in the same ecosystem and everyone is seeing each other's code. So again, Matt, you mentioned this as maybe a negative before. This is actually also a very big positive where if everyone is seeing how each other is like, implementing different patterns, implementing different UI structures, implementing different database connections, we can learn from each other really quickly because we're all working in the same repo. And we can take those and just, use them in our own. So like a lot of times when I'm onboarding a new developer, I give them a task, usually a very simple task of like, change this thing in the UI, like change this to be not a red button, but a blue button or something like that. And that forces them to go through and look at the patterns that are being used to set the colors, to set where the button is being imported from. And as soon as they kind of get that idea of that shared ecosystem that we have, they have a good idea of how the monorepo works, and they're able to pull in from everyone's like experience and build something super quickly without having to learn it themselves essentially from scratch. So the patterns that are implemented inside of a monorepo are much more shareable and much easier to track between each other rather than having like completely different implementations in every single polyrepo that are inevitable due to the fact that just there's less cross-pollination.
What would be like a common pattern, like building the nav bar, like or
Absolutely,
something?
yeah. So building a nav bar, that's a huge one for us where we have a shared nav inside of our UI library, but our navs are very interchangeable across all of our apps because we also obviously have to have different like navigation items. We have to have different navigation like directions, different colors, right? Like the different theming, everything is different in that. But the nav itself is shared component with a lot of builder components inside of it that allow you to add in drop-down light items and stuff like that. So I can 100% give them the task of like, hey, add this drop-down component in a nav on X application. And that would give them that whole understanding of, hey, okay, I need to go to this file in this application, but I see that the nav is actually in the shared UI library. So that's cool. And then it's like, how do I add a component? Oh, I just use one of these builders that have already been used. So just copy paste this into here, add another component. So then they get that whole pattern kind of really quickly. I always kind of push them towards one of these shared patterns because that immediately gives them the idea of how we're using the monorepo to our advantage rather than giving them like a siloed feature that doesn't touch any of the monorepo stuff, which is fine. Like, like they're going to get there eventually, but it's just better to throw them into the fire with the monorepo at least.
Well, they basically like can take like a piece of code and then like change the blanks or like add their own blanks and like do the modifications to that code rather than starting right from scratch then, right?
That's exactly it. Yeah, that's how all of our builder components work, is that like instead of they're very customizable, but you essentially just copy paste the piece of code that builds like the drop down item or the nav item and then put in like whatever about us into the in between like the nav item. And then you're able to even like, if you need to style it further and add an underline, you're able to just add a class to that and add an underline. But that builder component itself is shared. Okay. So there's certain styling that's already placed on that builder component. There's certain features like if it's a drop shadow or whatever, when you hover over it, that's all done. You just, as long as you've copy pasted the right one, you're good to go. So yeah, that's a big one. Improved collaboration. I've seen personally that be a huge asset in fixing errors. Like we've had issues where something has gone awry and the person that implemented that feature just doesn't understand or didn't catch it. And then we're having issues and then some other person that not even working on the same application, because he was part of the same repo and because he saw a PR request show up, is like, oh, maybe you added this because I didn't check that or something like that. And then all of a sudden they know where to look and they're fixing it. And it just becomes this like, the team just understands each other's implementations a lot faster and are able to help each other a lot easier. If it was just everyone was working in a polyrepo and siloed, it would be a lot more difficult to ramp up on each other's platforms, if that makes sense. Now, again, you can mitigate this with some templating, some like design principles in place, but having like even with the best design principles and the best linting and all that, you're still going to have situations where if you don't see each other's code, you're going to do things differently no matter what. You can't have someone always looking at every piece of code and making sure that it's exactly the same conformed. Even you can try and all that, but it's just not going to be the same as if you're actually coding in the same repo. The last thing here I have for one of the big advantages is continuous integration, continuous deployment streamlining, so CI/CD. Especially with Turbo, this is a big thing where it integrates directly with our hosting platform, which is Vercel. So when we're creating a new project in Vercel, it automatically detects our monorepo and it asks us, hey, which folder do you want this project to be like directed to? And then we can pick from the platforms, be like, okay, I want this one. And it'll automatically set everything up based on that folder without the other monorepo stuff that it needs to worry about. And so each of our apps is hosted inside of a monorepo, but it is a directly separate application because Vercel understands that they're all different apps, and it manages the dependencies and the streamlining of the actual like deployments pipeline with Git in a very, how do I say this? It's streamlined, but there are some intricacies that we'll be talking about in the challenges where you have to kind of adapt to it a little bit, because initially how it does it, great for when you're first starting out. Essentially how it works is when you're deploying one of your applications, it'll deploy all your applications. So if you add a Git, if you commit a Git change to your main or master, or even like a side branch, it will deploy all of the applications in staging environments, depending on which branch you commit to. And that in itself is great initially when you have one or two applications. It's really cool to see that, kind of making sure that your applications can build together. But as it scales, you need to adapt a little bit, because a deploy can be 5 minutes. You usually only have one worker to deploy. So that means you're adding every app that you add, you're adding at least 5 minutes to your deployment. And that can get just a little bit out of hand when you're deploying to staging environments. So again, overhead of tooling is part of the negatives for sure, but the fact that it does streamline it initially right away is really cool. Next thing we're going to be talking about are the challenges. So we've already talked about a lot of these, so I'm just going to kind of go through them really quickly anyway. But again, Monorepo is not a silver bullet. It's not perfect in any way, shape, or form. Even with the new DX, the new tools that are out there, there are issues, and we've run into them. Like through this year, we've run into multiple issues. So the first issue that we're going to talk about is the scaling issues. So large monorepos can become a little bit unwieldy. It can slow down your build times, your search, your navigation. Like that can absolutely be affected if you have more and more apps that are adding on. I just mentioned that, like, if you don't fix your build script, you're going to be building every single app on every single commit, and that is it's going to weigh you down. Like people are going to be waiting forever for their builds to finish, especially if you have 15 people working on the same application, every commit from every person. This is where you have to kind of go into the tooling a little bit and adjust it so that you make sure that you're not running into these scaling issues. Not something you would need to do with a polyrepo for the most part. Next thing here would be overhead of tooling. So because you're using an extra tool on top of something like NPM, right? Like NPM would be your regular tool that you would use for a polyrepo. You're using something like TurboRepo on top of that to manage your multiple workspaces and multiple polyrepos, PNPM. That is obviously going to add some complexity to it, right? Like there could be issues with one of your apps not seeing another app for some reason. There could be some random ass issues that can arise. As we know with any package manager, stuff can break as you get further and further into a project. So adding a tool on top of your package manager introduces a level of complexity there, right? And we've run into this, not gonna lie, like there's not been like a super smooth process. Like I said, that there was that 30% hit to some of our productivity because of stuff like this, where we had to learn how these repos communicate with each other on a lower level, how to optimize it so that we're not constantly building each one of these repos on every single build, how to make sure that we have the right dependencies between them. So like some apps need certain dependencies, other apps need other dependencies, how to make sure that when you're building an app, it actually builds the right dependencies in the right order. That's overhead that we had to learn because of the tooling, right? Now, again, this doesn't take away from the overhead of learning different tools in a polyrepo sense, where you would have to learn how to bring in the dependencies of all the other applications and build them in different orders. it's different kind of learning. So you're adapting to the tools that you have. Access control challenges. Matt mentioned this before, where if you have a situation where you need one team not to view other teams' code, whatever that situation may be, Monorepo probably isn't for you. You can't really create a siloed situation where someone clones a Monorepo but doesn't clone certain things. Having said, there's ways around this, but adding extra layers of complexity on it and making it a potential to be a leak, like if it's really important for someone not to see it, I would still advise against using a Monorepo in this situation. Even if you can solve it, right? Even if there is a way to solve it, I would still go away from it, because it's a good indicator for you that, hey, you want siloed. This is something you want. So why are you pigeonholing a solution that specifically prevents silo, specifically like goes against the siloed polyrepo mindset, just to make, some one extra feature or something that you need easier to build? I don't know. It is something you could try, but I would recommend against it. And again, access control also refers to if you want one app to be open source and another app to not be open source, that becomes a little bit too hairy to figure out how to manage that access control. Inside of a monorepo, I'd recommend 2 separate polyrepos for that.
With something like that, it's often good to question what the price of an accidental data leak is between the two things. Like, it's something that I'll mention to clients. I'm like, how bad would a data leak be? And if it's bad, then it's like, okay, well, how bad in comparison to the benefits then? If the monorepo is going to give you, like, if we break it down to a metric of points, if it's like, well, the monorepo is going to add 10 points, but if there's ever a leak, it's negative 1,000. It's like, well, probably shouldn't do this, right? I know it's convenient, I know it's great, but it's this method is something that I'll commonly use, not necessarily with points, but this sort of negotiation method is what I'll commonly use with clients when they want to collect user data just for the simplicity. Like, well, we could just have user accounts, and it's like, yeah, but are they going to be using them a bunch? Well, I only sell something once a year. Well, then it probably isn't actually worth us doing that then. And then you kind of have that conversation, and I'm like, well, what happens if all this stuff leaks? Now you guys who are not very, sort of techie, potentially have a data leak on your hands, and like, that's not good, right? And it's sort of like, well, you're right, and then that usually will shift their focus. So you kind of have to really take a look at in the worst case scenario, what's the consequence? In the best case scenario, what's the benefit? Do they balance out? Do they not?
Absolutely. And it's a good practice to kind of do with any feature you're adding, anything that you're doing. Just what's the risk? Like, what's the worst case scenario, and how would that affect your company? If it's like it would shut down the company, you need to add extra steps that you wouldn't add to something that would just like be a blip on the radar. The last thing here, and probably the one that's affected us the most, is risk of entanglement. So if you add a breaking change to one application, like a breaking dependency change, or a breaking change that takes down an application or something like that can't build an application, it makes it so that you can't build, that could propagate to all of your other applications inside of a monorepo. Because how a lot of times, depending on how you manage the dependencies, it will try, when it's trying to build an application for production, it will try to build all your applications and then choose the one that you need to actually put onto the server, right? So if you have one of your applications broken, it could break all of them. This has happened to us quite a few times. This doesn't break, like, usually this doesn't affect production. It affects like building for production, right? Like actually doing the deployment to production. Having said that, there's certain situations that, let's say, inside of a UI library, someone added a glitch into the calendar component, for instance, that breaks when you hit the calendar component page. So anyone that's using that calendar component across any of the applications, if someone goes on that page in production, it could break. And so if that's not caught, that becomes a problem. So that risk of entanglement, the more people touching the code base in different areas, it adds certain levels of chance to have an issue go down. Now, to mitigate this, you would do more end-to-end tests. You would add testing to your pipelines to make sure that that all apps can build and all apps can see the right pages, like the most important pages are live and stuff like that before actually pushing to production. So there's ways to mitigate this. And again, a lot of times, well, Yeah, this is one of the negatives of a monorepo. You have more chances of this happening because people are working in the same repository. I would say just another one to add here would be Git management becomes a little bit more complicated because everyone's working in the same repository. So you might at any time have, if 10 different people, 10 different branches all pushing to the same repository. So I've had situations where I've had to go in and do some pretty significant Git merges, go through 50 or 60 files to make sure that the merges are going well. Now, again, this is one of those growing pains. You figure out proper ways of handling your Git workflow, making sure that people are pushing to the right branches. It goes away with time, but initially this is one of those 30% productivity downers where you're figuring out how to work with a larger team that spans multiple different folders in a single repository. So before we kind of wrap up here, I do want to go into a little bit of our experience with TurboRepo. So this is going to be kind of a TurboRepo specific section where I'll talk about what sets TurboRepo apart. I'll just mention it because I've already mentioned it a couple of times. And then I'll talk about our workflow, how we're using it to actually make a better experience for us, and then just some pros and cons. So what's TurboRepo? How TurboRepo is different than other monorepos, specifically designed for Vercel. Again, really easy to integrate with Vercel. So that was a big plus for us. We're a Vercel team. And the second thing is that it does this thing called, it uses a caching for builds, right? So it has a system that allows you to check what one application built, and then use some of the same components from that application that are cached in the next build, making builds a lot faster. I haven't mentioned this yet in this episode because we haven't made this work very well with our application. Almost every time we try to use something like this, probably 60% of the time, the builds fail. Sometimes we've had situations where the wrong environment variables were in the cache, and then it just in production, it's failed a couple times. So we turned this off. This is probably a skill issue. It's one of those growing pain things where I was talking about where you have to kind of dive into that tooling overhead to figure it out properly. And we just haven't had that time yet. But this is just one feature of TurboRepo that we just have not used very well or at all recently because it's caused more headaches than it's solved. And we might revisit it at some point. We might get someone to come in and fix our setup for caching, because the advantages would be right now an app takes 5 minutes to build. With cache, it could take anywhere between 1 to 2. So it's a pretty significant time advantage. It might be worthwhile to invest some time into to save if you need a quick build or you're building something for production really quickly or testing or something. Okay, and our workflow, what do we do? So essentially in TurboRepo, we have an apps folder where all of our apps live. We have, I think, 5 apps at this point living under that apps folder. And then we have a lib folder where all of our shared packages live. So the difference between apps and lib, again, apps are ones that are actually being deployed. So apps are the things that Vercel touches. And then lib is something that's just being shared between applications, UI library, Prisma packages, just utility packages, different functions that are shared across applications. That lives in lib. The lib folder is not deployed separately, or anything in the lib folder is not deployed separately. Each app manages its own dependencies, and each app has its own scripts that you can write inside of your package.json file. And those scripts are usually launched from a central package.json script in the root directory of TurboRepo. So we have a lot of scripts in there, a lot of quality of life scripts that do stuff like start your database, start your Docker container for all your databases, seed all of your databases with some dummy data, start your certain application with the dependencies that it needs to start 2 applications with the dependencies that they need to start all applications with the dependencies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have different things like reset database scripts. All of that is easily done, quote unquote, if you know what you're doing with scripting, with something like TurboRepo or any sort of monorepo, because again, you're touching all of the code bases that you would need to power your applications. So it's a lot easier to bring in this dependency over here and this dependency over here inside of a script rather than writing across. You would have to write almost like a computer specific script if you weren't doing that. Something that would be checking your local file folder in a polyrepo situation. This is easier to manage scripting. So we do utilize that a lot, and that's been one of the biggest boosts we've seen with monorepos, where we're able to really quickly set up these really intricate scripts that allow us to start an entire like ecosystem of our app, test everything out, and then drop it down really quickly. All of our shared components are in a UI library. That library is super organized into different sections, so it's easier to manage and easier to import and stuff like that. So that's been a really big plus for us in the TurboRepo side of things. The other thing that we've done is we've put all of our Prisma clients in the shared library. So Prisma is a ORM that accesses a database. So essentially you can picture it like all of our database connections are shared between all of our applications. So if one app needs to access multiple databases, they just pull it straight from the lib. Really easy to access. All of our types are saved inside of the library there. So it's end-to-end type safe. So our database is typed using Prisma. And then all of our endpoints are typed using tRPC, which is a backend typing system that allows you to type like your backend routes and then be propagated to your front end. So everything is fully type safe from start to finish. That's a huge advantage of the monorepo here and how it works. And as well as our databases are able to be shared across any application. This is pretty convenient for us. And this was kind of one of the requirements as we were growing, is that we had applications that needed to access multiple data sets and multiple databases. So this made it much easier for us to do that. We have a lot of code sharing, obviously, again, utility functions, procedures like tRPC, like backend procedures that we share across functions, across applications. That's super easy with the monorepo. All of those are stored in lib, obviously. And again, a lot of Vercel, a lot of bash scripting stuff. Some of our scripting lives in a bash script. And this bash script actually helps us with that problem that I was saying earlier, where each and every commit that we had would start all the Vercel deployments at once. So I wrote a little bash script there that would check to see if you have certain messaging in your commit message. So I have like a flag for -- Vercel -- deploy -- app name. So if that's not present, it's not going to build an application. So now if you need to build one of our apps, you just put that into your commit message, and Vercel will automatically detect that and only build one. That solved a big percentage of our headaches with that whole deployment situation that we had. And yeah, just the pros and cons. Again, really easy to collaborate, really easy to share code. Those are the pros. Type safety, really, really good type safety. And with that script that I wrote, the deployment is really easy as well. Having everything in one, having the dependencies managed all in one go, it's just easier to do a safer deployment because you know what relies on what, or TurboRepo actually figures that out for you. And so you don't have to manually like start this one first, start this one second, start this one third, and then like wait for them all to finish before like having a heart attack that everything is deployed correctly. It handles that kind of passover for you, which is really cool. Cons can for sure be a little bit more complex to onboard a developer. Like I said, I have specific tasks designed to make sure that that's easier. But because of the fact that it's a monorepo and there's a million different things that could be happening at once, you need a little bit more guidance for someone to be like, okay, this is a monorepo, this is how it works. You need to explain the whole scripting folder in there, like how to start your databases, how to stop the databases, all of that stuff. That does take a little bit extra. Caching, I mentioned that caching was a pain in the ass. We turned it off. That was a con of TurboRepo for sure for us. And I mentioned before the Git management stuff. So having some merge conflicts that probably could have been avoided would have been nice.
Would you say that a software like TurboRepo is pretty well mandatory when getting into monorepos? Because the way I'm thinking about this is like, I guess the question actually is a bit, I guess, multifaceted as well. Is like a solo dev who's potentially just sort of working on their own projects or even working on their own portfolio, maybe even. Let's just bring the portfolio into light then. So let's just say you're working on your own portfolio. I mean, you may have 4 projects that you're trying to show off, and you may bring these into a monorepo. Like, do you think that sort of I'm going to call it a manager software like TurboRepo would be good for this? Like, do you think that something like a portfolio should be brought into a monorepo? Because I know that there's going to be some people listening to this now who are thinking, you know what, like maybe, instead of having 4 separate projects for my portfolio, I could have one repo called, my portfolio, and then I could have my 4 different projects within it. Like, is that is that something that they should be doing? And then if that is, should they be using an accoutrement software like this?
So yeah, it's a manager. It's a monorepo manager, I would say, more than like a software. But yes, if you're going to do a monorepo, I would recommend using something like this. Now, having said that, a simpler one, like just using PMPM workspaces, which is what these are built on top of. Some of these are built on top of that with just essentially TurboRepo is PMPM workspaces with the addition of allowing you to easily deploy on Vercel because it obviously is created by them and has some good hooks into there, and that caching stuff that doesn't really work for us. So theoretically and more practically, we probably would have been better off using the PMPM workspaces just for a simpler approach to this. We haven't had too many other than the caching stuff. It's been fine. Like TurboRepo has been fine for us, but we could have probably avoided that whole caching thing. But maybe we'll use the caching at some point in the future because I still am not. I still think that would be a pretty big benefit if we got it to work. It's just like there's certain things like the environment variable one killed me, where it shouldn't be bringing in old environment variables in a cache. It should detect that you need newer ones. Anyway, that seemed to be like a critical flaw in my eyes, and that's when I was like, oh nope, we're not doing this. Not a good
so like for the person that is a portfolio, like somebody who's listening to this potentially might be thinking that, right? Like I have a 4-project portfolio, yeah. Monorepo might work. Would you recommend TurboRepo, or do you think that they should be using something simpler? Like if they had come up to you today and asked you that, like what do you think? Like polyrepo, like is that better even on the employment side? Like does it look better to have multiple repos on the employment side where someone's like, well, you're deploying to 4 repos and not deploying just to 1? Like I don't know.
Point.
Like
it's a good point. I don't know if hiring managers would ever care about the amount of repos you have versus like if you have one good repo with multiple projects. Maybe like that might be like a shallow metric that someone might look at and be like, oh, they only have 1 repo. That's weird. And then move on. So maybe it makes sense to just pad that stat a little bit. I would rather have a monorepo. Like if I was a hiring manager, you know what? I think a polyrepo makes more sense. I'm gonna recommend polyrepo because for a hiring manager, let's say, if they're specifically interested in one of those projects, I would rather just focus on one repo rather than learning your monorepo setup and just figure out how you've done things. Like monorepo isn't that complicated that I would look down on you for not using one. Whereas if you're making my life easier as a person that's reviewing your code by sticking everything into like by having separate repos, that's probably going to be a bigger advantage for you. Because just from a practicality perspective, a hiring manager or a hiring engineer that's looking at portfolios, they have like 30 seconds, a minute to look at your code base because there's so many other applicants. So the easier you make that code base to view, the better. So that's why I think I'd recommend Poly.
Because I suppose because they're just browsing it on the UI, which is the web, like the website, like a github.com or something. And they'd be like, if they went to the issues, for example, like let's say this was something that was deployed, is used by a small number of people, even though it is a portfolio project. I mean, the issues, you don't want to be like, well, like, I as the project manager, I'm interested in your, I don't know, Spotify conglomerate project. And like, why is there something in here about a calculator? Yeah. Like it would be a bit of like that, I don't know what that calculator is. I'm out of here to the next, like it's potential, like possibly like to the next, repo, to the next applicant even.
And that might sound harsh, right? Like that might sound like it's a harsh thing and people are like, oh, well, like why would anyone care about the monorepo versus like, personally, yes, I wouldn't care, but I'm just thinking from a mindset of someone that's reviewing 100 portfolios a day and the inevitability of the human complex. Yeah, like a simpler, easier to read portfolio is probably going to win over a more complex monorepo where they have to figure out where your stuff is.
Right.
Just from that perspective, it's not it's just a harsh reality. Yeah, just to quickly wrap up here, there's what's the alternative to a monorepo? Obviously, we've talked about this. Polyrepo is the alternative to a monorepo. It's a one repo per project per package situation, and it's fine for a lot of situations. Like it works. You can still manage certain shared code workspaces, and in certain situations, you're probably going to be using it. A hybrid approach is probably a very similar one that people will use often. Like for instance, if you have that one app that has to be open source, you put that one in a separate polyrepo, and then the rest of them stay in your monorepo. And what you can do there is if you have a UI library in your monorepo, you can actually package that into NPM and still keep it in your monorepo. So you can have that kind of hybrid approach. I've seen that being used on a pretty consistent basis. That's a pretty common one. And yeah, that's about it for monorepos on my end. I'm sure I might have gotten some stuff wrong because, again, my experience with monorepos has been using it on an old project that I joined and I was really confused about, and actually implementing it over the past year. And that's where I've kind of drawn all of these examples from. So if I am wrong, please let me know. I'm on at HTML Everything on X, and I'd love to hear the criticisms.
Cool. So, I think that concludes my questions as well. Like, I didn't really know what a monorepo was. I kind of, the name kind of is self-explanatory-ish, but at the same time, you're sort of like, you don't really think of that. So interesting to hear the thoughts on that. And I'd love to hear your thoughts actually as the listener as well. I actually posted something on Threads just now on the HTML All the Things site, or the HTML All the Things profile, just like asking what do you prefer or something along those lines. I just typed it up during the episode, but something about monorepos and polyrepos. And this is my first time kind of deep diving into it. But if there's nothing else to add, Mike, maybe it is time to run the old conclusion.
Runner up.
Well, before we do that, remember that if you want to support episodes like this, you can do so at patreon.com/HTML All the Things. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons: Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se, Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server, and Stacy Mosteler from swoonworthydesigns.com. Also, we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on HTMLallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. And also, he just actually dropped, as of recording this, so it's going to be already on the website by the time you listen to this, he just dropped a new article on there. He's talking about and pulling from his experiences with guests we just had recently on the show, Shashi Low from the Gridiron Survivor project. So Michael has kind of entwined himself in there in some capacity and has started working with them. And so he wrote up a commentary, even a guide, if you will, on writing quality code, including having testing and why that's important, things like that. And he pulled upon his own experiences, real world experiences with the Gridiron Survivor project. So there's some really great examples in there. So go and check that out. I'll include that in the show notes as well. And the show notes, of course, will be at htmlallthethings.com as well as that article. So feel free to leave a comment or a review in the platform that you're listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.